Hello, this is Professor Keith Ross from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. This is another in my series of lectures for my criminal justice classes. This lecture is going to be for my corrections class, and we're going to discuss Chapter 2, which is Ideological and Theoretical Underpinning to Sentencing and Correctional Policy. So really what we're talking about now is sort of the final part of the criminal justice system. If we break down the criminal justice system like we did in the very first introductory lecture, we have the police, we have the courts. So police effect arrests, courts adjudicate or render verdicts, either guilty or not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, because we're talking criminal, not civil here. And then if a person has been convicted of an offense, society asks their government via the social contract to correct this bad or malfeasance, this bad behavior that's going on. So what we're going to be talking about are some of the philosophical underpinnings and or the goals of correction. We'll talk about some sentencing models and some criminological theories regarding correction. So let's get right into it. Some philosophical underpinnings, or basically what we're talking about, what does corrections do? What's its purpose? And one of the very first things is that one of the goals, for my class, the 5 that I want you to remember is going to be retribution, incapacitation, deterrence, rehabilitation, and proportionality. I'm actually going to talk about 7 different philosophical underpinnings, but those first 5 that I gave you, those are really the goals of corrections. That's what corrections seeks to do. Now, just because corrections might have one goal does not mean that they can't have other goals as well. These things don't operate in a vacuum. They work side by side, and depending on how society views its criminal justice system, we might weigh heavily in favor of one thing as opposed to another thing. Like if there's a strong crime control zeitgeist going through the undercurrent of society, we're probably more towards retribution. If there's more of like this due process model, and I'm referring to Herbert Packer's due process crime control theory, and it basically applies to police, but it works just the same for correction. So if we're more interested in that due process model, we're probably weighing closer to rehabilitation, but that doesn't mean it's just rehabilitation. We're going to sort of balance these ideas. We might be tipping the scales one way or the other, but they're both included, and all of them can be included. So these are the 5 goals of corrections. Retribution. You have wronged society, so now society plans to correct your behavior. If you remember in Chapter 1, we were talking about the Code of Hammurabi. So basically what retribution sort of talks about is an eye for an eye. You've committed an offense, you're going to do the time. Don't do the crime if you can't do the time, that sort of thing. Basically, in the book, it talks about a contained revenge by society against this offender, tempered with proportionality within the bounds of the law. So when we're talking about the law, we have to sort of remember, at least in the United States Constitution, and that's going to figure in when we sort of talk about proportionality, because retribution and proportionality sort of sound alike. However, there are some subtle differences. So retribution, an eye for an eye. Now, again, think about this. Sometimes our visceral or emotional response is not in line with an appropriate legal or rational response. Incapacitation. Incapacitation means exactly what you think it means. Basically, this offender committed an offense. He or she has been convicted. So what are we going to do? We are going to incapacitate him or her, meaning we're going to deprive him or her of their liberty to walk around in society. The thinking behind this is that if I have a prisoner behind bars, while they are behind bars, they are incapacitated. They cannot commit this offense in society. Not saying that they can't commit the offense incarcerated in jail in that system, but they can't commit these offenses outside. Deterrence. Basically, if I sentence you and I put you and I incarcerate you, hopefully you will be deterred by doing this again. Now, there are two types of deterrence that are referenced in the book. There is general deterrence. General deterrence talks about that if I incarcerate someone, other people will view the fact that I've incarcerated them, and they might think twice about committing the offense because they know that if there is this thing that they do, there is a consequence. That sort of hedonistic calculus that we talked about in the last chapter as well. Rehabilitation. I've said on a few occasions that one of the goals of the whole criminal justice system is that we want people exiting the criminal justice system better than they entered. One of the things that we want to do is if we have someone that is sentenced for some sort of term, we want to make sure that they leave better, that they leave equipped with skills to become functioning members of society. They've paid their debt to society. Now we want them to function within the society as a good citizen. Proportionality. And again, this is sort of let the punishment fit the crime. However, when we're talking about proportionality, especially in the United States, we have to balance this idea of this eye for an eye concept with also Eighth Amendment protections, that whatever the punishment is cannot be cruel and unusual and or excessive. So those concerns have to be balanced out. Restorative justice. Now, this is not one of the goals, but this is a philosophical underpinning of corrections. Restoring the health of the community and especially the victim of this offense. This sort of underpinning doesn't really have to do with the offender like the other five did. This has to do with more with the person who was wronged. And by extension, society has been wronged because this offense has been perpetrated against at least one victim, possibly more. And reintegration, again, and this sort of sounds, and it works sort of hand in hand with rehabilitation, this idea that if you're in jail, in prison, once you have served your complete sentence and you are a free person, we want you to now reintegrate into society. So we want you to work that 9 to 5. We want you to buy that house with the white picket fence and the 2.3 children and the trophy dog. We want you to pay taxes. We want you to be a contributing and a functioning member of society. Okay, we're going to go to the types of sanction slide. Now, most often when people that don't have much experience with the criminal justice system, when they find out people are going to get sentenced, more likely than not, the usual thinking is we're going to put them in jail. We're going to put them in prison. Not really the case. The majority of sentencing is non-incarceration, some type of community supervision, some type of like probation system, mental health programs, drug programs, where maybe someone's remanded to a drug program for 18 months, meaning that they can't leave the drug program. So really, the amount of people that get incarcerated is about 20 to 25%, which means that we use community supervision for about 75 to 80% of those people that have been sentenced. This chapter mentions a Supreme Court case, United States versus Booker. Basically, what this does, this allows judges to have latitude in sentencing, meaning that they can decide if there are, and I'll talk about this in a bit, if there are mitigating circumstances that maybe the penalty should be lower, something to that effect. Monetary, that could be paying a fine, probation, or intermediate sanctions. Now, intermediate sanctions means you're going to serve some of your sentence incarcerated in either jail or prison. However, maybe there's the chance of parole. And we'll get into this later. Please don't confuse those terms. Parole is not a sentencing option. That is something after someone has served some time. Probation, you're not serving time. You're being sentenced to probation. Less than 30%, like I said, about 20 to 25% of convicted offenders are incarcerated. There are mixed findings whether incarceration reduces or increases recidivism. This term recidivism means continually committing offenses. Could be the same offenses, could be related offenses, robbery, burglary, larceny, things of that nature. It seems that what we're trying to figure out is, when we're rehabilitating, are we actually rehabilitating, or are we just incapacitating this offender for a fixed amount of time? And once they get out, even if we've given them skills, will they commit that offense again? And this is going to be something that we're going to sort of hit upon all semester. Whether rehabilitation does work, and if it works, how does it work? Why is it working? Something to that effect. We're talking about incarceration. Well, obviously, we're talking about jails and prisons. Jails is the city-county level. Prisons are state level, and prisons are also on the federal level. And there's one other bullet point in the PowerPoint. Supermax prisons, and supermax prisons are usually, well, not usually, they are high security prisons for the most violent of offenders. Okay, so now we're on sentencing options. Probation. Now, probation is a type of community supervision. I'm hoping in a future chapter, I think it's either chapter 5 or chapter 6, it focuses on probation, and I have a friend who is a probation officer, so I'm going to want to hold a Zoom class and let her talk about her experiences as a probation officer. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What are the obstacles that she faces in the probation system and in the criminal justice system itself? Okay, so we're talking about mitigating factors and aggravating factors. Now we're talking about this in regards to sentencing. Who sentences? A judge sentences. So judges, and we're going to talk about this later, get what's called a PSI, or pre-sentencing report. And what happens is they're going to look at the complete picture of this offender. And we're going to try and figure out what this person did, how did this person do it, and also, more importantly, why did this person do it? Were there reasons? And we'll get into that later in this. So a mitigating factor is a factor that reduces the level of culpability of the offender, meaning that the person did commit this act, but there were reasons why. And maybe those reasons might mitigate or might lessen a sentence. Let's say a person kills a person that has another person at gunpoint. Well, this person's committed an offense, but was there a mitigating circumstance? Well, a judge might see it that way, that yes, there was a mitigating circumstance, that the reason why this offender killed the person that was holding someone else at gunpoint was to save that person's life. Maybe they were related, husband and wife, brother, sister, whatever the case may be. An aggravating factor is the exact opposite. These are things that magnify culpability. And when we're talking about culpability, we're talking about mental states here. We're talking about, did the person intentionally do it? Was there some sort of emotional distress? So like maybe an emotional distress, that could be considered a mitigating factor. But if a person just brazenly wants to kill people, that could be an aggravating factor. Indeterminate sentences and determinate sentences. An indeterminate sentence means that there is a range, 3 to 8 years. And the judge can sort of, with latitude, with that PSI, sort of decide how much or how little time the person that's being convicted is going to serve. A determinate sentence is a fixed sentence. You commit a robbery, you're doing 8 years. That is that. So usually on the federal level, there were, at least in the past, there were determinant sentences, and that's starting to change. Mandatory minimum sentences sort of works hand in hand with determinate sentences. Mandatory minimum sounds exactly the way what you think it would mean. It means that at least you're going to serve a specific amount of time. So if we're talking about a mandatory minimum sentence, person gets convicted of robbery, they're going to serve 3 to 8 years. At minimum, they must serve the 3 years first before there's even an option of maybe applying for parole. This mandatory minimum sentences limits the judge's discretion. On the next slide now, there is this sort of movement to limit determinate sentences and increase indeterminate sentences. And that sort of works hand in hand with rehabilitation. What we're trying to do is lessen the populations of jails and make functioning members of society. There were two things, the United States Sentencing Commission, which talked about reducing mandatory or reducing determinate sentences, specifically reductions for drug traffickers. Now, when we talk about the term drug trafficker, that's a person that's moving drugs or selling drugs. And if we're talking on the federal level, that means that they've crossed a state line. The Smarter Sentencing Act, I'm actually going to read a quote in the book. This is on page 41. This is from Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. According to Cruz in 2005, the issue that brings us together today is fairness. What brings us together today is justice. What brings us together today is common sense. This is as diverse and bipartisan, meaning both Democrats and Republicans agree, array of members of Congress as you will see on any topic, and yet we are all unified in saying common sense reforms need to be enacted to our criminal justice system. Right now, today, far too many young men, in particular African-American young men, find their lives drawn in with the criminal justice system, find themselves subject to sentences of many decades for relatively minor, nonviolent drug offenses. So these sentencing movements and commissions are specifically there to address perceived biases in the criminal justice system and to correct sentencing disparities, that maybe an African-American male might receive a harsher sentence than his Caucasian counterpart, or maybe a lower socioeconomic offender receives a harsher penalty than his or her higher socioeconomic compatriot. One of the things that we have to sort of address and be honest with each other is that this sounds great, that we want to change, we want to address these inequities in the criminal justice system, and we want to do it for this moral, virtuous reason. But there is another reason, and these reasons are purely economic, and they're purely sort of spatial, because we were getting to a point where the amount of people that were incarcerated federally, there were more people than there was actually space for. And we really don't want to start putting highly violent people together because they're going to be violent against each other. If you look up statistics, and I'll use New York City statistics as an example, the cost to house one prisoner in Rikers Island, which is the city or county jail of New York City, is anywhere from about $50,000 to $61,000 a year per inmate. Now, that's a lot of money. $61,000. I'm going to assume that some of you in my lecture work and you probably make less than $61,000. And that number is factual, but it doesn't even tell the whole story, because really that number talks about just the inmate. When we start figuring in personnel costs, correction officers, social workers, mental health workers, all of these other things, the number, and I believe it was in a New York Times article, stated that it cost New York City about $148,000 per year per inmate. So obviously, we want to reduce that money and fund that money back into other avenues of society. Okay, we're going to go to the last part of this lesson. This part is criminological theories. And again, these are theories. These are possible explanations as to why people commit offenses. You and everyone has to look at the positives and the negatives of each theory and decide, does it make sense in your mind? And you don't have to subscribe to just one theory. You can blend theories together to maybe make another theory. That's up to you. So individual personality traits, these are specific traits that lead certain people to commit offenses. People that are typically defiant, self assertive, hostile, possibly narcissistic. These people have a lack of empathy for humanity or other people. Classical theory, punishment should be proportional because if the punishment is correct, it will correct this bad behavior. So if the punishment is adequate enough to address the offense that's being committed, this sort of theory states that the punishment will fit the crime and it will deter in the future this person from committing that offense. Behavioral psychology or operant conditioning, meaning that the reason why people commit offenses is due to environmental or external factors in their life. Maybe they're of low socioeconomic means. Maybe they were physically, sexually, mentally, or emotionally abused as a child. These could be reasons why. When we're dealing with offenders and we're dealing with this idea of operant conditioning, there are reinforcers and there are punishments. These are things that elicit a certain type of response. Reinforcers elicit positive responses. So if I have an offender and they're doing something good, they're enacting the behavior that we wish to see, well, we'll start rewarding them. Maybe give them kitchen privileges, things like that. On the opposite side, punishments are exactly what you think they are. They are unpleasant. They are negative reinforcers. Let's say an offender commits some sort of infraction. Maybe they lose privileges. Maybe they had a work assignment. They lose that work assignment, maybe for a specific period of time, maybe completely. Social learning theory. Exposure to crime teaches crime. So we're talking about this idea that people, places, and things, that if you have family that have committed offenses, or you live in, let's say, a lower socioeconomic neighborhood that in addition has high crime rates, well, you're learning by your observations. You're learning by what you see, what you live on a day-to-day basis. That's what this idea of social learning is. Strain theory or institutional anime. Obstacles to success may increase crime. If you cannot obtain success in the quote unquote right way, well, other ways will sort of pop up. And what this sort of talks about is the haves and the have nots. Let's say I live in a low socioeconomic neighborhood and I can't afford an Apple Watch, but I really want one. Maybe instead of going to get one or two jobs to save up for that Apple Watch, maybe I take an easier route and maybe just steal it from someone else. That's this idea of strain theory. Labeling theory. Stigmas may promote self-fulfilling prophecies of criminal behavior. So, person commits an offense, they serve their sentence, they get out. And let's say they are a convicted felon. Maybe we can even say that they're a convicted sex offender. Now, if you owned a house and you knew that someone was coming to rent your house and they were a registered sex offender, and maybe you have children in your house, you might think twice about renting to this person. These people have issues finding employment. So what happens? Well, if you can't find employment, if you can't find housing, you have no stability. So what happens? You go back to your operant conditioning. You go back to that strain theory. You go back to what you know. So I tried, but this is why I did it. Conflict criminology. Inequality and power in the quote unquote system increases crime. So we're talking about class distinction, the haves and the have-nots, the proletariats. And this sort of theory sort of stems from Karl Marx and communist theory that capitalism benefits the rich only. So crime can help people improve and climb that social ladder. Now, that's up to you whether you believe that or not. Again, these are just theories that are being posited. Okay, well, I think that's going to be about it for me on this chapter. I wish you all a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.